Back in the very early days of this channel, the second video I ever made, probably not released, but the second video I ever made was about the Kursk disaster. Put simply, I had no idea what I was really doing, and I kind of made a dog's breakfast of it. Not the information so much as, well, the audio, the recording, and, basically everything else. And to this day, it's one of those videos I was never able to get monetized because, well, reasons. But today, though, I want to go back and actually talk about the disaster in far more depth, to discuss the political fallout from it, how in many ways it shaped modern Russia and how you can directly link it to the modern Russian Navy, which, mind you, is currently doing its best Titanic impression under the weight of an immense drone barrage. I believe, as I was writing this, another patrol boat got blown to sky high, so, it's doing well. But today, it's time to return to the Kursk and talk about how things always get worse and how the Russian Navy began the post-Soviet era just as crappy as it left it, and somehow made it worse. Welcome to the Russian Navy Sucks part. Well, I guess it's 2A, technically. The Kursk. Going back to it and looking at it in far more depth. Oh, and I never remember to say it, so please do hit the hype function, which only some of you can do because YouTube. Like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. The internet used to be a fine place. It used to be great. You could not give up your personal information and you could use it without, having to give up your ID, your face, your phone number, and, maybe a kidney or two to let you in. Traditional VPNs often aren't much better. They can both see your identity and the sites you visit. Obscura is a VPN that physically can't link you to where you are with your internet activity. And it's open source, allowing fellow nerds to check their source code and service for themselves. Obscura also has built-in ad and online tracker blocking that you can configure yourself. You can control how much individual websites can track you. Now, I took this ad personally because I received this lovely pop-up on all my videos, which is beyond hilarious given that YouTube is banned in Russia anyway. Now, I know I have a following in Russia, particularly in minority communities who are forced to use VPNs to reach the outside world, but a lot of VPNs aren't safe and will sell them out if the price is right. Obscura got my tick of approval because, well, you don't even need to link a personal email to your account, you can just use it. So, if you want a privacy-first VPN, go to obscura.com/everything, or scan the QR code and get 25% off on a subscription for only $6 a month. Simply download the app on Mac, iPhone or Android, Windows and Linux is still coming, and get started. Thank you again to Obscura for sponsoring the video. A wonder weapon to make NATO quiver. The great equalizer to the numbers. A submarine that could take off and shrug a torpedo hit. The K-141. In many ways, she was the pride of the Russian Northern Fleet, an immensely powerful Oscar II class submarine that was all these things and more, according to state media. See, Kursk was built at the Salvage shipyards in Severodonetsk, a historically significant and heavily fortified naval port near Arkhangelsk, northern Russian Arctic coast. Of particular interest with the Kursk is the timeline of her build. See, she was laid down in 1990. The writing was on the wall, but the USSR was still very much in existence. But she was only commissioned into the Russian Navy Northern Fleet on the 30th of December 1994, well and truly after the fall of the Soviet Union. The new submarine was named after the city of Kursk, the site of the largest tank battle in military history during the Second World War, and also now one of the locations that Russia has been invaded in the 21st century and had to use North Korean soldiers to liberate. For Russia, a country totally on its knees economically following the collapse of the USSR, the submarine was in many ways the ultimate propaganda tool. She was, in the eyes of the Russian state, a projection of what Russia still could be: formidable, modern, unkillable. In many ways, it's somewhat prophetic that modern Russia is what not only killed the submarine, but also doomed the entire crew, and in some cases, to a fate that is hard to imagine. The Kursk, as I mentioned, was an Oscar II class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine designated Project 949A by the Soviet and Russian naval planners. She was given the NATO reporting name Oscar II and she measured 154 metres in length, displaced approximately 24,000 tonnes when submerged, and was driven by two OK-650B nuclear reactors capable of pushing her up to 32 knots underwater. Now, sidebar here, and it's really only for the Americans who always freak out. I am saying it properly. Nuclear, not nuclear, as Homer Simpson would say it. I am Australian. I have an Australian accent. That's why I say colour, not colour, and water, not water. Believe it or not, a world exists outside the United States, and I will not be lectured on pronunciation by a country that says herb instead of herb because you forget how to say the letter H. Anyway, back to the Kursk. Her outer hull was constructed from 8mm steel plates, covered up by up to 80mm of rubberized cladding designed to minimise acoustic signatures and reduce detection by enemy sonar. She was kind of designed with the thought in mind that she would be fighting the Los Angeles-class attack submarines, and in some cases there would also be knowledge on the newer Seawolf and future pipeline submarines that the Western powers were putting into the water. Within this outer hull, there was an inner pressure hull separated from the outer hydrodynamic hull by 3.5 metres, and this held all the crew compartments, the reactor, the breakable bits. The submarine's primary design philosophy was built around the destruction of American aircraft carrier groups. Each Oscar II class would carry 24 P-700 Granite cruise missiles. These are also known by the NATO designation SSN-19 shipwrecks, a nickname that Russian propaganda today loves to play on, and these missiles were mounted in angled launchers on either side of the hull. And each Granite missile could carry a conventional warhead weighing up to 749 kilograms, or alternatively a 500 kiloton nuclear warhead. Each had a range of over 600 kilometers, and in addition to its missile armament, the Kursk were equipped with 6 torpedo tubes, 4 533mm and 2 650mm with 24 torpedoes. And yes, these torpedoes could also carry an atomic warhead. Within those 5 years of service prior to her sinking in 2000, the Kursk had only completed one deployment, a 6-month-long flag-waving journey to the Mediterranean to extensively monitor the US fleet conducting operations as part of the response to the crisis in Kosovo. Other than that, the submarine had spent the entire time tied up to the port. Now, I mentioned this in the original video, but it wasn't uncommon during this period of the Russian Navy and, well, really even warships today, in the Russian Navy particularly, to be forced to act as power generators for the ports they found themselves in. Famously, it's one of the reasons why Kuznetsov is in such a bad state and can't operate without a tugboat despite having sailed basically nowhere. Well, that and the mazut and the engines being completely cooked. Maybe I'll do a video on that soon. But it's one of the big reasons that Kuznetsov is screwed and will never ever sail again under its own power. The Kursk, though, with reactor power, would be far more effective in this role, and so she sat idle, doing essentially nothing for years, existing as an attempt for Russia to scream into the world that it was still a major power. It should be noted here that I'm not insulting the Kursk crew. Her commanding officer was Captain First Rank Gennady Lyachin, himself a decorated and experienced submariner. The crew of 118, 44 officers and 68 enlisted men included some of Russia's finest naval personnel, many trained in the Soviet Union too, during what was a highly competent submarine force. These men would do everything right, everything that was asked of them. And that's exactly why they died. Before we go into the naval exercise, there will be a few people who have asked in the past why Russian submarines are so heavy on the officer count on their crews. 44 officers and 68 enlisted. It's a big number of officers compared to enlisted, and it really comes down to roles and trusts. Unironically, the best explanation of this kind of structure versus Western naval structures is in the novel Hunt for Red October. In that novel, there is a sequence between two characters where a Russian officer who is defecting speaks to an American enlisted sailor who has the exact same job as him. And in that, they explain the level of trust and competency in officers in the Russian Navy, Soviet Navy, and the Western Navies. An enlisted sailor can be trusted in the Western Navies to do a lot that in the equivalent role in the Russian or Soviet Navies could only be trusted to an officer. It's why in very sensitive vessels, such as submarines, you see a very high count of officers versus enlisted. The fated exercise was to be called Summer X, and it was the first major Russian naval exercise to take place in over a decade. The post-Soviet collapse had been completely catastrophic for Russia's military, and in particular the Navy throughout the 1990s. This is really indicative of the entire post-Soviet Russian Federation, unless you're an oligarch. For example, I can tell you anecdotal first-hand accounts of highly educated workers from large industrial cities like Kursk, who went from one day being about to buy a car to being unable to afford basic foodstuffs. Underfunding, deteriorating equipment, demoralised personnel, and institutionalised disarray had become watchwords for the Russian Navy, and it was now effectively a collection of glorified rusty 80s and 70s ships playing pretend at being a modern superpower's armada. It was still, though, thought that the submarines were the big equaliser, that the Russian submarine fleet was still just as formidable and it could take NATO on, but it too would sit idle, unmaintained, and its officers left en masse for better paid civilian work. Summer X was meant to signal a reversal of that decline and to peacock the power of the new president, yes, that one, the bald one, Putin. In a way, though, this would actually foreshadow what really was behind the facade of the strongman. Just not in the way that Putin wanted it to, and not in the way that was planned, but it would teach him the lessons on how to avoid it in future. On the 10th of August 2000, the Kursk left its home port of Vidvyayo, a closed military town on the Kola Peninsula, and headed into the Barents Sea. The Barents, for those who don't know, is a shallow Arctic sea sitting above the Arctic Circle, bounded to the north by the islands of Svalbard and Franz Josef Land. It's cold, it's miserable, but it's vital to control in any hot war between the west and east, and it's also the primary base of Soviet nuke boats for this exact reason. On the morning of the 12th of August 2000, Kursk was positioned in the Barents Sea, approximately 135 kilometers from the naval base at Severomorsk, preparing to conduct a simulated torpedo attack on surface targets as part of the exercise. Captain Lyachin reported to the exercise controllers that the submarine was about to execute the mock attack, and then at 11:29:34 in the morning, local time, all contact was lost with the submarine Kursk. There was an initial explosion that was relatively contained, it was sharp, and it localized a detonation in the forward torpedo room of the submarine, and the Norwegian seismological stations would report a small seismic event of moderate magnitude at that exact moment. 135 seconds later, though, they recorded a much larger second explosion that occurred, and this explosion, we know now, tore through the bow of the Kursk with a force equivalent to anywhere between 3 to 7 tons of TNT. Seismographic stations registered an event measuring 4.2 on the Richter scale at the time of the explosion, and the shockwave from this explosion was detected by monitoring stations across Scandinavia and allegedly as far away as northern Alaska. Thankfully, and yeah, given what happens to the remaining crew, I'm saying thankfully, the two explosions killed the majority of the 118 men almost instantaneously. The personnel in the forward compartments, the torpedo room, the control room, and the adjacent spaces had absolutely no warning, and in many cases the men inside were simply vaporized with little remaining of them. Others were killed by the pressure wave, the fire, or the flooding that followed. When the Kursk was eventually raised the following year, forensic examination would determine that 3 of the 118 crew members could actually not be recovered at all, that their remains had been entirely destroyed by the blast. But, and this is where you will understand why I said what I just said about them dying instantly being a good thing and it's not a callous thing, not everyone died in those first 2 minutes. In the rearmost section of the submarine, in the 9th compartment, a turbine room at the stern, 23 men survived. They were separated from the forward carnage by sealed watertight bulkheads and several hundred tons of submarine machinery. They had made it through the explosion alive, but what followed for them can only really be described as a nightmare. The aft survivors would gather together in the 9th compartment, a space approximately 8 meters by 3 meters. With the reactors shut down, there was no power, no heat, no light, except for battery-powered emergency lamps. Importantly too, there was no functioning air recycling system, meaning that the oxygen in that compartment was extremely limited, and to make matters worse, the compartment was partially flooded with icy seawater. The temperature in the Barents Sea in August hovers just above freezing, so the compartment's metal walls, offering no insulation at all, left the men in darkness, in the cold, in rising water, and in a submarine that lay at the bottom of the ocean with its bow destroyed. It is the worst place you could ever be, and the stuff of nightmares. The officer who took command in the 9th compartment was Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Koleshnikov, 27 years old and the commander of the Kursk turbine section. Within the darkness, riding by a faint light of a battery lamp, Koleshnikov compiled a list of the names of the 23 survivors. He noted the time, approximately 1:15 on the 12th of August, roughly 1 hour and 45 minutes following the explosion, and he wrote a brief message to his wife Olga, a school teacher in St. Petersburg, before folding the notes together and placing them in a plastic bag within his breast pocket. Far from just accepting their fate, the survivors did attempt to hold on as long as possible, expecting that the rescue vessel would be sent to save them. Firstly, they would attempt to improve their situation when it came to oxygen, the first threat that they faced. They decided to use the chemical oxygen generators nearby. Now, these were devices that reacted potassium superoxide with carbon dioxide generators. And the idea was that the chemical reaction would release breathable oxygen. If they worked, they would have been largely able to replenish the compartment's dwindling air supply, but at some point one of the cartridges fell or was possibly dropped by somebody suffering from a lack of oxygen into the water that was flooding the floor of the compartment. Reacting with the sludge in the water, the cartridge triggered a flash fire that consumed the compartment's remaining oxygen. Investigators examining burn marks in the bulkheads later determined that the floodwater in the compartment had reached waist height at the moment of the flash fire, and that some of the men had plunged underwater in an attempt to survive it, but it didn't make a difference. The fire ate the compartment's oxygen supply, and the men who dived under the water rose only to suffocate in the compartment, unable to breathe. It was death by burning, drowning, or suffocation. In the dark, alone, cold, at the bottom of the ocean. The initial explosion would have been merciful when you think about that, which is why I said it. The evidence suggests that the 23 survivors in the 9th compartment survived somewhere between 6 to 8 hours after the main explosions. However, tapping sounds detected on the hull of the Kursk by nearby Russian naval vessels during the first days of the disaster may indicate that some of the men may have actually stayed alive considerably longer, with some early reports describing tapping that continued for days. However, forensic and scientific evidence recovered during the subsequent salvage operation is inconclusive on this point, and I should mention the investigation was naturally undertaken by the Russian government, who had every possible reason to lie. But what was happening on the surface while the men died in the dark? Well, that's why this video is called The Russian Navy Sucks and not The Tragedy of the Kursk. Because this whole thing was totally avoidable. And it's possible that those men, even after the disaster, those men in the rear compartment had a chance. But it was Putin who took it from them. The Russian Navy lost contact with the Kursk at approximately 11:30 on the morning of the 12th of August, at the moment of the first explosion. But, for reasons unknown to common sense, it was decided to not declare an emergency until 23:30 that night, nearly 12 hours later. Remember how I stressed that big second explosion, and how big that second explosion was? You know, the explosion that allegedly was heard as far as Alaska? No biggie, right? Just we don't worry about that, coming straight from the submarine. After a first one? No. Okay, we ignore that. Anyway, the Northern Fleet's commander, Admiral Vyacheslav Popov, conducted a press conference the following day on the 13th in which he celebrated the success of Summer X, without mentioning that one of, if not the most powerful submarine in the entire Navy had been lost. Moscow was doing what it always did in a disaster, and it did it well, working from a combination of institutional denial, bureaucratic inertia, and apparent genuine confusion about what even happened. If you're seeing similarities to Chernobyl and the meme line from the TV show that RBMK reactors can't explode and that graphite wasn't there because you didn't see it, well, you're not wrong. The Russian state failed for hours to acknowledge that something had even happened, let alone that something had gone catastrophically wrong. When rescue operations were finally initiated on the 13th of August, they were plagued by failures that, if it wasn't for the fact 23 men were suffocating to their death, or were possibly already dead by this point, we wouldn't really know. Well, if it wasn't for those horrific factors, this would have been hilariously stupid. The deep-sea rescue vehicles were sent to locate and dock with the Kursk, the vehicles specifically designed for this purpose. Well, see, they couldn't actually get down there to dock with a sub because they were rusted and in a complete state, and they couldn't work properly. Repeated attempts to then attach the vessels that they got working to the submarine's near escape hatch failed because the vehicles themselves were old, poorly maintained, and had never actually been tested on an Oscar II. The United States, Britain, France, Germany, Norway, and Israel, meanwhile, all offered assistance in the hours and the days that immediately followed the disaster. Of particular note is the British, Norwegian, and American intelligence services knew about the accident by the end of the 12th of August, allegedly before the Navy even bothered to tell the Kremlin about what had happened. The Western powers, Norway in particular, had highly capable deep-sea diving teams with extensive experience operating in these conditions, and Britain had a manned rescue vehicle, the LR-5, that could have been deployed rapidly. Both Norway and Britain kept making these overtures over and over again, and at every instance they were refused. Western powers asked again and again, and they got told no. The Russian government insisted that its own rescue capabilities were sufficient enough and that everything was under control. Saving face was more important to them than the lives of the men aboard. It was not, dear viewer, to your absolute shock, under control. The Russian Navy's own resources proved wholly inadequate. Those rescue vehicles just kept failing. Divers could not penetrate the damaged hull, the weather of the Barents Sea deteriorated, and all the while the Russian government maintained publicly that the crew were alive, they were having a chat to them, and that rescue was imminent. These statements, military officials later acknowledged, were false. No contact was ever made with the submarine, no one inside the Kursk communicated with the outside world after the explosions, and the official assurances given to the family of the crew were lies. This is why I said the tapping that they heard from the hull may never have happened, because, well, everyone's lying. Putin, meanwhile, who had been inaugurated as president just 3 months earlier, was on holiday at the Black Sea resort of Sochi when the Kursk sank. He remained there for 5 days, he did not cut short his holiday, he did not return to Moscow and manage the crisis, he did not speak to the Russian public directly. He did not accept international assistance, and he pushed them away until the 17th of August, a full 5 days after the submarine had gone to the bottom. It was only then, under intense domestic and international pressure, that Norwegian divers were allowed to deploy. On the 21st of August, after some rigmarole, the Norwegian divers were able to reach the rescue hatch of the 9th compartment. They were quickly able to, with equipment that functioned as it was supposed to, open up the compartment and get into the hatch in a matter of hours, where they found the compartment flooded and the bodies of the dead floating inside. To put it bluntly, the second explosion was something that no submarine could have ever survived. No matter how well it was built, no matter how big it was enormous. It destroyed the first 3 compartments of the boat entirely. The bulkhead separating the first and second compartments was driven backwards entirely. The torpedo room where the warheads for the practice torpedoes and other weapons were stored is largely responsible for this. Temperatures in that torpedo compartment at the moment of detonation have been estimated to reach as high as 2700 degrees Celsius, with the blast causing a large hole through the Kursk hull and sending the boat straight to the sea floor. Kursk came to rest on the bottom of the Barents Sea at a depth of approximately 108 meters, or roughly 354 feet below the surface. Meanwhile, the reactors, which had been running to power the submarine, had automatically shut down upon detecting any damage. This is a point here in which the builders of the Kursk really deserve some praise, because although the entire disaster, including the absolutely enormous explosion, had, ripped the thing apart, the reactors remained inert and stable throughout the entire disaster, the sinking, and the time on the bottom. There was no release of nuclear material, no radiation at all, and the ocean around the wreck is totally clean. That's where the positives really end, because now we have to ask ourselves the big question. What caused the first explosion? Now, the official Russian inquiry into the Kursk disaster was, as could be expected given the nature of the vessel, conducted under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. A 113-volume investigation was undertaken, but the public was given access to only a 4-page summary, published in the newspaper Rossiyskaya Gazeta in 2002. The summary described it as stunning breaches of discipline, shoddy, obsolete, and poorly maintained equipment, and catalogued negligence, incompetence, and mismanagement across multiple levels of naval hierarchy, and it concluded that the rescue operation had been unjustifiably delayed, and the Russian Navy had been completely unprepared to respond to a disaster of this kind. If you're wondering how that is so openly critical, believe me, that will not occur in future. This was a wake-up call to Putin, and I'll get into it shortly. The investigation concluded that a faulty weld on 6576 kit practice torpedo was to blame. The torpedo was used a propellant called high-test peroxide, commonly referred to as HTP. HTP is a highly concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, and under normal conditions, it's relatively stable. But when it comes into contact with certain catalysts, including many common metals such as copper, it decomposes, and that decomposition is extraordinarily rapid, and then HTP will expand by a factor of approximately 5,000, generating steam and oxygen in an instant, and in essence going kaboom. The investigation determined that HTP had leaked through the faulty weld in the torpedo casing and entered the torpedo tube, contacted metal impurities in the shoddy build of the torpedo, and then triggered a thermal explosion equivalent to 100 to 250 kilograms of TNT. That initial blast then ignited the torpedo's kerosene fuel and generated a fire that shortly thereafter detonated between 5 and 7 fully armed torpedo warheads in the compartment, with each torpedo carrying a 450 kilogram warhead, each powerful enough individually to sink a surface ship, and this is where the second explosion came from and sent the submarine straight to the bottom. Investigators also found that the rescue beacon, the thing designed to float and automatically to the surface in any disaster and assist rescue teams in locating the sub, well, it had been deliberately disabled prior to the Mediterranean deployment, and it was never reactivated. But no, we're not done yet, because the safety instructions recovered from the wreck were found to be written for a different type of torpedo entirely, and were missing essential steps for testing relevant air valves, the ones that likely caused the explosion. Another thing that was found out is that there were reports of entire stocks of torpedoes getting dropped off large vehicles and smacking into the concrete before being loaded onto submarines in the Northern Fleet, including the Kursk. Yeah. A salvage team would actually also later discover the inner tube hatch cover embedded in the bulkhead separating the first and second compartments, 12 meters from the tube itself, which is physical evidence that the internal doors had not been fully closed at the moment of detonation. Not that this would have saved the men from the politicking of the Kremlin, but you get the idea. Keep in mind that this is all according to Russian sources, so if you disagree with me with what I've just said for Western bias, just know this is according to Russian sources. And this is what they admit went wrong. And hey, it's not like they ever lie, right? On HTP though, it had historically been used as an oxidizer in torpedoes for decades, particularly in, for example, the Royal Navy before this. That is until 1955, when the HMS Sidon was sank in a similar manner to the Kursk, with one of her HTP torpedoes reacting with internal coppering of the torpedo and causing an internal detonation, this time within Portland Harbour. 13 men died in this incident, thankfully the warhead didn't detonate, and in response to the Sidon incident, the use of HTP was totally removed from the Royal Navy. Officially, HTP has since been removed from the Russian naval stock since the Kursk loss in 2000, but this is not verifiable, and there are rumours that it is slowly making its way back into service as a cost-saving measure during the war in Ukraine. Although, again, this is not verifiable. The Kursk really was Putin's first crisis, and interestingly, one of the few he didn't cause. And his response to it shaped public perceptions about his leadership in ways that have endured for decades. His decision to remain on holiday, to refuse foreign assistance, and to allow the Russian military to mislead the public about the crew's condition generated fury amongst Russian citizens. And likely still feeling pretty bold after Glasnost and the fall of the USSR, they were pretty open by the standards of the day. Of course, this also showed Putin that people could be a problem, and steps would begin to be taken so that this could never again repeat. If you want evidence of this, only take a look at the death toll in Ukraine, even by the most propagandized Russian numbers of below 10,000, which is mental if you believe those numbers in of itself, because there are more than 10,000 videos of Ukrainian drones killing Russian soldiers. It's still in order of magnitude lower than the losses on the Kursk. The Kursk caused a political pushback. 1,000 Russian men die in a week to drone strikes, while Kronstadt naval base burns 26 years later and nobody bats an eye. Putin learned his lesson with the Kursk, and you can see it. This was clearly on display when Putin finally did meet with the families of the Kursk crew at a gathering in the Arctic port city of Vidvyaya on the 22nd of August, the port where the Kursk was based. Televised footage showed grief-stricken relatives confronting the president with raw anger and emotion, and one mother, Nadezhda Tilik, confronted Putin directly from the crowd. In response, a government official injected her with a sedative on live camera. Just watch it. That tells you everything you really need to know about this situation and Putin, doesn't it? In September 2000, during a televised interview with American journalist Larry King, Putin was asked what happened with the submarine. Putin smiled, smirked, and then said, "It sank." The clip circulated around the world, and it really does represent what Putin thought about his men, how little he gave a crap about the lives of the people he ruled. But again, Compare that outrage with the ignorance of today, and it begs belief and shows you what can happen in just one generation when one man controls the media cycle. Putin would not take the fallout well, and he very quickly moved against independent media outlets that had covered the disaster critically. The television channel NTV, owned by media magnate Vladimir Kaczynski, had broadcast searching and unflattering coverage of the rescue, and within months, Kaczynski had been forced to sell his media assets to the state-controlled energy company Gazprom. RTR, Russia's other major independent news television station, was similarly brought under state control. The Kursk disaster marks a turning point in the relationship between Putin and the Russian press, accelerating a process by which critical journalism has been systematically oppressed. Bill Clinton, who was the American president at the time, and who later reflected publicly on the disaster in a 2025 documentary series, alleges that Putin had deliberately delayed accepting international assistance in order to prevent foreign access to sensitive information about Russia's nuclear submarine technology. According to Clinton, the decision was not primarily one of wounded national pride, but out of a strategic calculation to protect military secrets. Military secrets, mind you, on a now 1970s-era submarine that was for all intents and purposes a glorified propaganda tool. The allegation, though, is consistent with the behaviour of the Russian military officials throughout the crisis, who appeared at various points more concerned with controlling information than with rescuing their men. However, I would personally argue against the former president here, that the kind of reaction is also indicative of the fact Russian high command simply did not know what to do, and so they immediately fell onto old Soviet habits of buck passing and pretending everything was fine for as long as possible until they could either scapegoat their way out of it or find some kind of excuse to save their own skin. In October 2001, 14 months after the disaster, an international salvage operation led by Dutch company Mammoet and Smit Internationals would succeed in raising the Kursk from the bottom of the sea floor. The operation itself cost approximately $65 million, and to this day it's one of the most ambitious deep-water salvage efforts in maritime history, and certainly one of the most impressive. Working in Arctic conditions, the salvage teams used a combination of cutting equipment and hydraulic lift systems to detach the submarine from the seabed. The bow section was a total mess. It was mangled, it was wrecked, and it was just unsavable. So, due to that, it was cut away and left on the sea floor. This section included the first 3 compartments and the location of the explosions, and the decision to abandon this section of the boat was made purely on safety grounds. Given the structural instability and the fact that there was unexploded ordnance in the bow, the remaining sections of the submarine were lifted intact and towed to a dry dock in Rosylyko, near Murmansk, while the bow was just left in situ. There, forensic teams would work through the wreck, recovering bodies and personal effects and gathering physical evidence for the investigation. In total, 115 crew members were recovered, and as I mentioned before, the remains of the other 3 could not be found, having been destroyed entirely by those initial explosions. Among the bodies found in the 9th compartment were those of the 23 survivors, still clustered together near the escape hatch waiting for rescue. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov's body was found with his notes still folded in his breast pocket, protected by that plastic bag which he had wrapped them in. Despite extensive burning and damage to his body from the attempts at getting the chemical oxygen filters working, the notes were still legible. His list of 23 names, his message to his wife Olga, and his final recorded words saying, "All crew from the 6th, 7th and 8th compartments went over to the 9th. There are 23 people here. None of us can get to the surface. I am writing blindly." A second note, written by an unidentified sailor, was also recovered. It described conditions of the compartment in blunt clinical terms: carbon monoxide from a fire, rising pressure, rapidly diminishing air. It ended with a simple, "We cannot last more than a day." The recovered bodies of the crew were buried with full military honours in cemeteries at Murmansk, St. Petersburg and other Russian cities, and memorials were erected. A monument was placed in Murmansk, and the families of the dead received compensation payments from the Russian government. The wreck of the Kursk, after forensic examination, was subsequently towed to Sayada Bay, also known as Sayada Guba, which is a remote Arctic inlet where other decommissioned Russian nuclear submarines are stored, and allegedly it was broken up over the following years. But it is likely that parts of the submarine may still survive even to this day within that area. A lot of submarines in that inlet are extremely old, extremely questionable, and extremely dangerous for the environment, so a bit of the Kursk still being there would not be shocking at all. It has been a quarter of a century since the Kursk exploded and sank, and due to the events of the 21st century, and well, how insane they are, after all, there are weeks where it feels like years passed, it's now largely been forgotten. Hell, it isn't even the largest vessel lost by the Russian Navy over the last 2 decades, looking at you, Moskva, and now your dozen Corvette friends on the bottom playing submarine with you. What the Kursk is, though, is an early example of what Russia has become today, and in many ways, the events that played out in August 2000 play out daily now in Ukraine. A country so convinced on its own Kool-Aid that it's still a superpower, sending young men to their death to save face from the fact they are fighting a war that even if by some miracle they now take all of their military objectives today, they will still have lost in the long term due to the death and destruction it has caused. The parents of the Kursk disaster, the loved ones, the wives, the children, were pushed aside, drugged and removed from the equation, and at least one case we have literally seen it on film. And as for the great Russian submarine fleet, it's still now being treated by online Russian propaganda campaigns as the great equalizer, the thing that can destroy the West but simply it chooses not to. But it's gotten sadder. See, it's not just the Russian submarine fleet anymore, it's one particular submarine and one torpedo. One. The lies are so bad that they can't even keep up a good one anymore. As for the Kursk, though, a lot has been made about whether or not Western rescuers could have made a difference if they had been allowed to go and try, and honestly, it's irrelevant if they could make it or not. It doesn't matter if they could make it or not. The fact was they were never given a chance to try, because the state's face, the president's face, was more important than the lives of the sailors who died alone on the bottom of the Barents Sea. The Russian Navy is just a part of its state, and the Kursk above all tells us how and why the Russian Navy sucks. Well, that's the revised story of the Kursk. Thank you again for Obscura for sponsoring this video, and special thanks to everyone who likes, comments, subscribes, and of course my supporters on Patreon and members. If you still want me to go back and cover old stories from the Russian Navy that I covered back in, the early periods of this channel, or old videos that I did for the first year and a half when I did what I didn't understand how to make a microphone work without, 50,000 sounds in the background, comment them. Tell me what videos you'd be interested in me going back to, which ones you want me to cover again, which topics you think could deal with a bit more fleshing out. Back in the day, I struggled to make a 15-minute video, now I struggle to keep under it, so let me know. And yeah, write your stuff in the comments below. I will catch you all next time.